particularities of the Japan-Korea relationship, it would have been had to be up to the United States to really be the catalyst for that, but that there would have been over time, and this doesn't happen in one day or 1 week, but there would have been over years, I think, again, a growing sense in which the two could work together even more than they do today. The U.S. focus on China, therefore, within this regional context, I think has been one of the, I'll use a provocative word, I don't mean it fully, one of the impediments, let's say, to developing a more fully fleshed out trilateral relationship between U.S., Japan, and Korea. Again, for whatever reasons, political, economic, or otherwise, the U.S. has been betting on developing China either in terms of a responsible stakeholder, strategic reassurance, whatever you want to call it, and I would argue, in essence, trying to fit in its alliance relations, both with Japan and Korea, into that broader relationship, which it truly thinks would be much more effective regionally and globally. And that may be a point of contention, but I think that is at least an unstated impetus to how the U.S. has approached these sets of relations. However, what happens regionally, of course, is that the U.S. gets confronted, or Japan or Korea gets confronted with crises, and very quickly find that its closest working relationships are back at that hub and spoke or embryonic trilateral relationship. Obviously, we see that today with the Cheonan crisis. We've seen it through North Korea. More broadly, we've seen it in terms of other issues such as the global war on terror, which, let me use that then because I want to wrap up and get to some questions and the like, to shift into this question of the global shared initiatives and responsibilities. Obviously, you don't draw a line, between Northeast Asia and the rest of Asia, Northeast Asia, and the rest of the world, even when there are, particular sets of problems that focus your attention. Because of the position that the United States has held, over the past 60 years, the global sense of linking together as much as possible, I would argue, its discrete policy preferences or goals in a particular region with a broader global outlook to uphold the generally liberal international system that was created in the post-war, means again that as the United States, to me at least, looks at its relations with Japan and Korea in terms of solving regional problems, it immediately links them up into more global issues. I'm not saying always smoothly or even always consciously, but I think that comes into play at various times. The post 9/11 global set of activities that the United States engaged in, which were not solely the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but a much broader set of initiatives to try and prevent prevent proliferation of nuclear materials, to have literally a worldwide, in the Bush administration's view, worldwide war on terror that, of course, stretched well into Asia and was justified, I think, by the terrorist attacks in Indonesia and other areas, fit very clearly into the U.S. view of how it wanted to leverage relations with its allies in Asia at the same time that it was dealing with regional problems. The particularity or the historical circumstance of having Prime Minister Koizumi in Japan in office after 9/11 meant that for the first time Japan literally leapt at the chance to play a much more expanded role than it ever had. And again, if you compare Japan's 1991 response to the Gulf War with its 2003 response, it is of a different order of magnitude. From our perspective, and a U.S. perspective of saying, at the end of the day, what's your skin in the game? What are you literally contributing? It may not have seemed that much. For Japan, this was a quantum leap forward. And I think we shouldn't forget that Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces ships were in the Indian Ocean for 8 years. It did send, doing refueling exercises that just recently ended. Japan did send reconstruction teams to Afghanistan and to Iraq. This was very significant. As usual, however, in terms of America's global activities and global military activities, South Korea was right there from the beginning, as it has been so many times in the past. And to a degree that I think, I don't want to say the United States takes for granted, but certainly expects that it will be able to count on its South Korean ally. And this is something I do want to come back to at the end, so remind me if I forget the set of how we should rethink our expectations. So during this period, Japan, in a way, was trying, under Prime Minister Koizumi and then briefly under Prime Minister Abe, was trying to stress what you might call a global Japan vision, right? This was the years in the first part of the George Bush administration where we were going to have, as it was called, a truly global alliance with Japan. I don't think it was ever defined. I don't think it was ever really fully thought through, to be quite honest. And the upshot is I don't think the Japanese were ready for that. I think the Japanese were ready under Prime Minister Koizumi to do a few things that seemed to make sense in the exigencies of the time. But the alliance, and quite frankly the relationship that the United States and Japan had had for 40 years or 50 years was, I would say, fairly narrowly bounded. Very important, but fairly narrowly bounded. And when you stretch the conception of what the alliance should be, I think you put great strain on the expectations of both partners. And I think that came out to play as time went on, certainly once both Koizumi and Abe left office. So as this idea of a global Japan began to shrink, suddenly President Lee comes in with his idea of a global Korea. I think, again, you see this almost mirror imaging. And this fit in very well, I would argue, with the initial tenets of the Bush administration. But by the second Bush administration, by the end of the administration, I think there was major retrenchment going on. The wars were not going well. There was desperation simply to win the wars and keep the lid on lots of other problems. And I think in certain ways there were missed opportunities to take advantage of what President Lee wanted to do early on. And he came out with very, very clear statements about where South Korean policy would be going vis-a-vis North Korea and other areas. However, once the Obama administration came in, I think that they found a very solid working relationship and set of congruent interests about global activity. And it has worked very well into the key concerns of the Obama administration, such as nuclear nonproliferation, and South Korea will be hosting the next major international summit, the G20, and other issues, revamping PSI and the like, where South Korea has, again, in a sense that I think is both policy or solidly policy-oriented, but also with a confidence of playing a role, has very much met with approbation in the Obama administration, but also a real sense that there can be work together. So let me shift, because I do want to get into questions and answers to some reflections. Then what does this all mean, and does it have any legs? Is it going to go anywhere? And I think the way to begin answering that, at least one way, is to look at the continued validity, or not validity, but viability. It's valid, but viability of the hub and spoke arrangement. So again, in the post-war period, the United States, as opposed to creating, and rightfully so, as opposed to creating a NATO, or attempting to create a NATO, which would not have worked in Asia, a sort of joint, unified alliance of like-minded nations, the United States created a set of bilateral relationships that in the U.S. national security policy were interlinked, obviously. They were not interlinked necessarily between each of these spokes, with the U.S. being at that hub. I think it worked very well. I mean, again, if we want to look historically, I think that hub and spoke worked probably far better than we might have given it credit for over the long term. Alliances, again, are not natural political relationships to have. Traditionally, they're relatively short-lived. They come up because of a particular crisis, and they either solve the crisis or don't. They break up, whatever it is. But we've had these multi-generational, open-ended alliance commitments now for half a century. On the Korean Peninsula, it's easy to understand why. And absent that, I think it's very uncertain what type of relationship we would have had with South Korea. The Japan case is the one, I think, where you have much more reaction to geopolitical vicissitudes in East Asia. I mean, it's very clear why, in the immediate post-war period, you would have a tight U.S.-Japan relationship. The U.S. taking on the security burden of protecting Japan from whomever might have been interested in taking any action against it. That then shifts into a coordinated and, I think, unsung but very effective partnership in the Cold War.